Hi. So I'm Anne Quarshie from LUT University, and I'm going to tell you about a paper that I wrote together with my colleague Rudy Leuschner from Rutgers University. And our paper is on interorganizational interaction in disaster response networks. And in particular, we look at the response effort for Hurricane Sandy in the state of New Jersey in 2012. And in this paper, we in particular focus on the response effort and the roles taken by the New Jersey state government, as well as the practices used by it during the response.
All right, so we started this whole research project when Anne came to visit us at Rutgers, and we discovered that there was some interest in working together, and then as we sat down and figured out what we could possibly work on, this idea of looking at Hurricane Sandy came about, where we mainly had a big natural disaster, and the whole state of New Jersey shut down in a very similar fashion to what we have right now with COVID, but it was just caused because trees were across the roads and power was out. I think I was out of power for almost 2 weeks, which I had never lived without electricity for 2 weeks in my life, so it was interesting. And when we think of the recovery effort in general, they had to build a supply chain. And they had to build it out of nothing in a very short amount of time. And one of the main themes that we came back to was, well, they built a supply chain, and in many ways they didn't follow the same rules as what we see in traditional supply chains. So there's something there to be learned. And it was done by people who didn't necessarily have professional supply chain experience. They're mostly nonprofits and government workers. And there are some companies involved, but it was a very interesting topic. And we said, well, why not study something that is so different from what we typically have? So that's how it all got started.
We collected data primarily through interviews. So we interviewed 29 individuals representing 18 different organizations. As I mentioned, these included actors from 3 different sectors. And in addition, we collected a lot of archival data. For instance, I was invited to join the distribution list of a nonprofit coalition. So I received almost on a daily basis emails that were targeted at this organization's nonprofit members as well as government partners. And then we also did field research, including participating in practitioner conferences during the recovery stage in 2014 when we conducted this study, as well as some local events. And we were also invited to tour a command center of a utility firm to actually see how they recovered from the disaster. So for about 5 months in 2014, we did interviews and field research for this study, and then we used the data that we had collected to build a theoretical model that explains this interaction process. Yes. So our findings. So we looked specifically at the roles played by the government within this interorganizational network, as well as the practices used by it. And we concluded, based on our data, that the state agencies mainly took on 3 roles. And these were the roles of an organizer, a facilitator, and a supply network member. And then we identified altogether 16 practices that the government used in these 3 roles, and created this model that explains the interaction process and in particular the practices used by the government during the response stage. Now, in brief, the organizing practices used by the state were beneficial in the sense that they helped to bring some order to this network of actors, which started expanding in the response stage as new actors became involved. And it kind of helped the state agencies to, steer the activities of these various actors. And then the facilitation practices used by the state, they were helpful in the sense that they helped all of the actors to kind of know their respective roles and responsibilities, as well as help to ensure that they had access to the skills and assistance and information that they needed to have a successful response. And then finally, the supply continuity practices that we identified, they help to ensure that not only the state agencies had access to the goods and services that they needed, but also that other actors stayed operational. So the state put in quite a significant effort to make sure that businesses and supply chains in general stayed operational. And for instance, actively managed the flows of actors such as major retailers during the response. Yes. Our study makes contributions to and has implications for both the humanitarian research area as well as wider conversations taking place in the supply chain management discipline, in particular the emerging discourse on networks whose focal actors are not firms. And for the humanitarian research domain, our model could be considered an initial theory of interorganizational interaction in disaster response networks. And we believe that in the future, scholars could both, test hypotheses related to the practices that we identified, as well as extend our model based on studies conducted in other types of contexts. And in addition to natural disasters, these could include, health emergencies, as well as slow onset disasters such as climate change and biodiversity loss. And then, as for the emerging discourse, our study contributes especially by taking a government perspective. So far, many prior studies have looked at organizations such as NGOs, but there haven't been many studies that look at governments as focal actors within complex networks. And we believe that our findings can be helpful both for scholars looking into interaction in complex networks, as well as future studies on supply chains. And for instance, the organizing practices that we identified are quite new in this area. Not many prior supply chain studies have really considered organizing elements in supply chains.
In terms of implications of the research, I think one of the interesting takeaways is that, as I alluded to earlier, we had a supply chain that was functioning in terms of helping a state recover. And the main idea that we took after analyzing all of our data and looking at prevailing history was that idea of partial organizing, and partial organizing could be a factor in other types of supply chains. So when you have a supply chain come together for a very short amount of time and then it disperses and then you plug in something new, I think a lot of companies, especially with the challenges we're facing today, we can find ways to make supply chains more agile by plugging and playing. In many ways, technology kind of showed us the way that you plug in a device into your computer and it works. And similar lessons hopefully might be learned from this experience, because you can find ways to cooperate with non-traditional supply chain partners, and it doesn't have to follow those same old rules. So that's our big hope for the future, and hopefully practitioners pick up some of these ideas and researchers add on some of their findings, and there's a lot more to be done here.